Sara Peach has spent nearly a decade reporting on the most pressing environmental issues of our day, with a special focus on climate change. Her work has appeared in National Geographic, HuffPost, Scientific American, Environmental Health News, and Grist, among others. She's also the senior editor at Yale Climate Connections, a podcast and radio program that airs weekdays on more than 380 stations nationwide. Previously, she taught journalism at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Lou Brown is a cultural anthropologist, senior research scholar, and director of programs at Duke University's Forum for Scholars and Publics. She has over 2 decades of experience in research, education, and outreach. As a native of rural North Carolina, she seeks opportunities to make connections between Duke scholars and community-based expertise found in communities all over the state. Please help me welcome Sara Peach and Dr. Lou Brown.
Okay, thank you so much for being here. I want to just briefly thank Durham Public Library and Duke University and all the people who did so much work to put on this event. And I also want to thank all of you. I just found out from Dr. Brown that Bernie Sanders is speaking at Duke tonight, as well as Reverend Barber. And so I know that I'm competing with them, and you chose me. Thank you.
It was a difficult choice, I gotta tell you.
Yes. So I want to know a little bit more about you all. Raise your hand if you live in Durham right now. So most of you, all of you. Raise your hand if you have lived in Durham for at least a year. How about at least 5 years? Keep your hand up. How about 10 years? 20 years? Okay, wow, this is wonderful. All right, so you're gonna know what I'm talking about. So I grew up right here in Durham. In fact, I went to elementary school just down the road from here at Southwest Elementary. And so I know that Durham is not quite the same place that it was when I was a little girl. So you have lived here for a long time, and you know what the weather can be like here in July and August, right? And the worst days are those days when it can get up to 95 degrees or even hotter than that, right? It's just miserable and sticky and awful. And so one of the things that has changed here in Durham is that we're having more of those days. When I was young, it was typical to have 8 to 10 extremely hot days in a typical summer. Now we're averaging about 20 extremely hot days every year. So in other words, the number of those miserable summer days has doubled. And that's just in my lifetime. And I'm not that old. Or at least I like to think that I'm not that old. So something else has changed. That warm weather that we've been having has been really, really good for one particular creature. Does anybody have a guess about what that creature could be? Yeah. Yes, I heard it. Y'all are smart. Yeah, a mosquito. So according to this organization called Climate Central, they did an estimate of how much our mosquito season here in Durham has lengthened. And they estimate that it's now 41 days longer than it was in the 1980s when I was born. So again, that's a change that's happened in my lifetime. And if you go down to the beach, it's becoming more common to see scenes like this. This is my father at Pawleys Island, South Carolina last summer. And when I took this picture, there hadn't been any rain that day. There certainly hadn't been a hurricane or anything. But when high tide came in, the streets started to flood. And that's becoming a more common event down at the coast in Wilmington and other cities along our southeast coast. In fact, in Wilmington, there have been hundreds of additional coastal flooding days in the past few decades that just didn't used to be normal. So in my 35 years on Earth, North Carolina has gotten warmer. The mosquito season has gotten longer here in Durham, and our coastline has started to flood a lot more often than it did in the past. And all of those trends are in line with what climate scientists have been observing around the world They're seeing similar kinds of trends in a lot of places. And those kinds of observations, that's one of the reasons that climate scientists agree that climate change is real. In fact, at least 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is real, and it's caused by people. We're causing it when we're burning fossil fuels and releasing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And as many, many of you know, carbon dioxide acts kind of like a blanket around the Earth. It's trapping heat, just like your blanket traps heat around you at night. And as we add more and more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, that blanket it's kind of getting thicker. And we are getting hotter and hotter. And because we are continuing to add more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, we are expected to get hotter in the future. And what that means is there will be more changes in Durham. So I'm here tonight to talk to you about my most recent reporting project. For the past few years, I have been traveling to a lot of places around the country and meeting people who are just like you and me, but they're on the front lines of this issue. They're already starting to be affected by climate change. And I've been interviewing climate scientists, top climate scientists in the field, and learning about what these changes mean for you and me and our families here in Durham. And I gotta say, some of it's kind of scary, but I think that you deserve to know about that. As a journalist, I firmly believe that you deserve to have that information and that we can talk about it as a community about what we can do. So what I'd like to do tonight is share a couple of the stories that I've been reporting on recently about health and about our food supply. And then in the Q&A with Dr. Brown, what I'd really like us to get to, if y'all want, is we can start talking about solutions. Because there is a lot that people in the Triangle can do about this problem, both to prepare and to make the problem not as bad. So I want to start with a story, a really old story, like incredibly old. It's the story of the 10 plagues of Egypt. Is anybody familiar with that story? Yeah? So what's happening at the beginning of the story? Why were there 10 plagues of Egypt? Does anybody remember?
They were sinful. Were they?
Yeah, you could say that.
I mean,
What?
God was.
Moses flooded Egypt and he visited Egypt with 10 plagues.
Right, yeah, so Moses was in Egypt. The Israelites were slaves there. And Pharaoh wouldn't let Moses' people go, right? And so the God of the Israelites started to send this series of plagues to torment the Egyptians. And so there were a lot of these plagues, 10 of them, in fact. And 3 of them were insect plagues. Depending on your translation, there was a plague of gnats, and there was a plague of lice, and there was a plague of locusts. In addition to all those insects, there was a plague of livestock disease, and there was a plague of hail. There was a terrible storm that came down and destroyed a lot of the crops in the fields across Egypt. So I'm talking about these plagues because recently when I was reading the National Climate Assessment chapter on agriculture, I started to feel like I was reading something that was ripped straight out of Exodus. And let me give you some examples of that. So let's talk about the insect plagues. So one of the concerns that climate scientists have for agriculture in the future is that insects will be able to move into new territories where they never were a problem before. They'll be able to move farther north to higher elevations, and they'll also be able to spend more time in the year because they'll come out earlier in the spring when it gets warm early, and they'll survive longer into the fall before the winter frosts come. And they'll have more generations of insects, and they'll be able to cause more damage. So that's one new challenge for our farmers. There's a plague of livestock disease. Animals just like us, can be pretty sensitive to heat. And if it gets too hot for them, they get sick, and they can even die. So this actually happened last summer in California. There was a record-breaking heat wave there, and thousands of cattle died. And then there's the storms. Global warming is changing our atmosphere in ways that make it more likely that we'll have more floods and droughts and extreme weather. And so as you can imagine, just like for the Egyptians, that is a challenge for our farmers. And you don't even need to get into a time machine and travel 50 or 100 years into the future to see what that can look like, because it's starting to happen now. Okay, so this is Saul Para here on the left. Saul is a farmer in California in the San Joaquin Valley. And he grows watermelons and a lot of other tasty things that we really like to eat here in the Triangle. Saul is a young farmer. And so when he was just getting started around 2009, 2010, 2011, he was getting started as a farmer right as California was about to slip into its worst drought in at least 500 years. And there have been a number of scientific studies that suggest that that drought in California was made worse by climate change. So what happened to Saul was that the state of California cut his water allocation to 0. He had no water at all. I want you to imagine you're a farmer and you have no water. What do you do about that? Any ideas?
They were using fracking water for some of their crops.
Uh-huh.
Gray water.
What else could you do?
Cut back production.
Yeah, cut back production. In fact, that's one thing that Saul did. He let several of his fields go fallow. So on the left here, that's one of his fields where he's not growing crops. And then on the right, he had been irrigating and growing alfalfa. Any other ideas about what he could do?
Drill the wells.
Yes, he did that too. He bought some very expensive wells and very expensive pumps and started sucking water from the aquifer beneath his land so that he could keep his crops alive. And another thing he did was he installed a pretty expensive irrigation system so that he could control every drop of water that hits his fields and send it right to the plants. So my sort of larger point here is that farmers are adaptable, they're creative, they're definitely not stupid. And to a certain extent, they can respond to these new challenges. Saul still has a farm. But doing that it's expensive. It's really expensive to buy pumps and install them. It's expensive to get a new irrigation system, and it's expensive to just let some of your land lie empty. And so one of the concerns that economists have for the future is that our food prices will get relatively more expensive as our farmers respond to these plagues of insects and livestock disease and storms. So I've been speaking about the 10 plagues of Egypt, so I shouldn't leave out the 10th plague. Does anybody remember what the 10th plague of Egypt is? That's right, death of the firstborn. So I bring this up just to say, like, basically, how scared should we be? What's going to happen to our children and their children? And it looks like that for the next few decades and for our children, actually, a lot of people won't really notice here in Durham. And that's because we are relatively affluent here. We spend a small percentage of our incomes on food. But for people who are already struggling with hunger in this community, and especially for people around the world who are struggling with malnutrition, this is a bigger problem for food prices to go up. And then if we look more into the long term, there is a concern in the scientific community about something called multiple breadbasket failure. And I want to define that. So what's a breadbasket? Does anybody know what a breadbasket is? Yeah.
It's rice and wheat and other grains.
Sure. Yeah, it's a place, it's a region where we grow commodities like that. And it's a region that typically produces a lot of those kinds of crops. So we have one here in the United States. It's called the Midwest. And so a breadbasket failure is when that region, for whatever reason, just doesn't produce the crops as normal. And that happened in the Midwest in 2012. There was a drought and the corn and soybean crop failed. And prices of food did go up. Although, does anybody remember noticing that? Did you notice at all? Probably not. Because, again, a lot of us are affluent, and this doesn't affect us all that much. So the concern with a multiple breadbasket failure is what would happen if there is a breadbasket failure in more than one place in the world in the same year. And probably the result of that would be more of a shock in food prices. And that's a growing risk as we continue to warm and warm the planet. In fact, there was a study that came out in 2015, a kind of preliminary study that calculated that right now, our risk of a multiple breadbasket failure, they called it a 1 in 100-year event. So in other words, we have about a 1% risk in any given year of having an event like that, and that would send the prices up. But what they warned in that paper was that if we continue to warm the atmosphere and we continue to have more and more of these problems for our farmers, that risk does go up. And by 2040, it would be more like a 1 in 30-year event. So I think that's a very serious concern, not just for us here in Durham, but for around the world. And I hope we can talk more in Q&A about what we might be able to think about doing. How could we in Durham protect vulnerable people? What could we as US residents do to get the US to support people around the world who might be at greater risk in the future? So now I want to talk about health. And I want to introduce you to this guy named Chuck Yowling. So this is Chuck. He was a triathlete, in fact, a very serious triathlete. He completed 110 triathlons over about 30 years of his life. And he was living in Austin, Texas in 2012 when there was a massive outbreak of a disease called West Nile fever. Raise your hand if you're familiar, if you've heard of West Nile fever. Yeah, a lot of you. So it's caused by mosquitoes that spread the virus. And during this outbreak, it was actually the worst outbreak in US history. There were thousands of Americans who got sick with it, and 286 people died. So unfortunately, Chuck was one of the people who got sick. In August 2012, he collapsed in his apartment. And it wasn't until the next day that his friend Richard realized that something was wrong because Chuck didn't show up for happy hour. So Richard went by his apartment and got a maintenance guy to break into the apartment, a maintenance guy named Tim. And Tim crawled in through the window and discovered Chuck lying unconscious on the floor of his bedroom, just burning up with fever. So they got Chuck into an ambulance and took him to the hospital, where Chuck ended up being one of the more fortunate people. He woke up. When he woke up, he was really disoriented, so disoriented that he didn't even recognize his own sister who was in the room with him. But Chuck is such a determined athlete that one of his first thoughts was, when am I going to race again? What Chuck didn't know was that the virus had attacked his brain and the linings of his brain and his spinal cord. And it had paralyzed his legs. So his neurologist believed he would, at the time, he believed that Chuck would never race again. So how does something like that happen to a guy who's this strong and this fit? How does he get so sick? Well, diseases are really complicated. And anytime someone gets ill, there's usually a few different factors in why that happened. And that's true of Chuck. But I do want to talk about one factor that stands out in his case, and that's climate change. So the winter before Chuck got sick, it was an unusually warm winter. And then the next spring was also unusually warm. And it was really wet. In fact, it was the rainiest spring in Texas history. Now, both of those kind of weather patterns are in line with the overall climate trends in Texas. Just like here in North Carolina, Texas has gotten warmer and continues to get warmer. And extreme precipitation has gotten more common there. So both of those weather patterns were really advantageous for one critter. What was it? Yes. So there was a team of epidemiologists that looked into this epidemic that made Chuck so sick to try to figure out what had caused it. And in a paper that they published in a prestigious medical journal, they concluded it was the extreme weather. So what they speculate happened is that the fall of 2011, before Chuck got sick, there were probably a number of mosquitoes that were infected with the virus. And then ordinarily, those mosquitoes would have been killed in the winter. But because there were hardly any hard freezes that winter, they survived. And then that spring, when it was warm and wet, they got a head start in circulating the virus. And they said that is what precipitated the outbreak. So, of course, diseases have been with us for a really long time, and mosquitoes have been with us for a long time. So I called up one of the epidemiologists who was involved in this study and talked to him. His name's Dr. Robert Haley. And I asked him, well, Dr. Haley, did global warming play a role in this? Was that a factor? And he said, yes. He said, in the absence of warming of the climate by fossil fuel burning, it almost certainly would not have grown into so large a human epidemic. He believes that basically climate change acted like the fuel on top of the few cases that started at the beginning and made the epidemic a lot larger than it would have been in the past. So he's concerned that in the future we could also see some larger epidemics of vector-borne illnesses like West Nile fever. But that's not the only thing he's concerned about. So I want to touch on two other health concerns that public health officials are pretty concerned about that are quite relevant to us here in Durham. The first is heat. And it sounds a little bit silly. You know, we could just turn air conditioning on if it gets hotter, right? But heat can be surprisingly dangerous. For people who spend too much time outdoors and don't realize that they are overheated, they can get things like heat stroke. But it's also a concern for people with certain health conditions, chronic health conditions, because heat stresses their bodies and it can make them sick and unfortunately can even kill people to get too hot. So nobody is immune to heat, but there are certain populations that are more vulnerable to heat waves than others. So that includes, like you might expect, people who spend a lot of time outdoors, like homeless people, farm workers, construction workers, landscapers, high school football players. There's also folks whose bodies tend to be more sensitive to heat. They're also a population of concern. That includes pregnant women, seniors, and children. And then African Americans, because of existing social inequalities, African Americans are a population of concern because they tend to be more vulnerable when there is a heat wave. And then, as I said, people with certain chronic conditions that are incredibly common, like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, dementia, mood disorders, and problems with substance abuse, all of them, their bodies tend to be more sensitive to heat. And so that's something that we can think about here in Durham of how do we protect people in those vulnerable populations. Now, the really insidious thing, I think, about heat is that it also makes air pollution worse. There's actually quite a few different ways that it can make air pollution worse, but I'll give you just one example of that. Does anybody know what ground level ozone is? What's ground level ozone?
It's caused by cars and industrial processes, and it causes the heat to be trapped
Yeah, so it's a pollutant. As you said, it's an irritant to the lungs. It's especially damaging to people with asthma like me. And it forms, like you were suggesting, on hot, sunny days. It forms from a chemical reaction that happens on those hot and sunny days. And so the concern is that as our climate gets warmer, we'll have more and more of those hot days, and ozone pollution will become a bigger problem. And this isn't, again, it's not really a long-term problem. It's something that's starting to happen now. And the definitive report on climate change and health that came out under the Obama administration, it warned that this extra ozone pollution by the 2030s, so a little more than 10 years from now, that climate penalty of increased climate ozone concentrations due to climate change would result in tens to thousands of additional ozone-related premature deaths per year across the United States. So that's another serious concern. So just like with heat, no one is immune to air pollution. We all have to breathe. But there are certain populations that are more vulnerable than others. That includes low-income people and people without air conditioning. Because they have less control over their indoor air environments, the outdoor air can come in more easily. And also people with chronic conditions like asthma and COPD, hypertension, and diabetes. So what I'd like to have you do is I would like you to look at this list. And if you feel comfortable, raise your hand if someone that you care about falls into one of these categories. Yeah, so it's most of us. And so I think that's why it's really important to think about, and we can talk about this during the Q&A, well, what can people in Durham do to address these issues and make sure that everyone in our community gets taken care of, that there's less air pollution and people are protected from the heat. So I want to wrap up, but I do want to tell you what happened to Chuck Yowling after he got out of the hospital. So Chuck spent a few months in rehabilitation centers and then a few more months and years with physical therapists. And he was able to eventually stand up again using his walker and then trade his walker in for 2 canes and then get rid of one of the canes and start walking around with 1 cane. And so last summer, which was 5 years after he got sick, he decided at the age of 72 that it was time to try racing again. So he signed up for a race in San Marcos, Texas, where he was asked to swim 500 meters and then bike 12 miles. And so I had the chance to go and see him compete in that race. And I'm very happy to say that he finished the race and he said it was glorious. I personally take a lot of inspiration from Chuck's story. I think it says something about how even when you get a really scary prognosis, it's important to have courage and to keep going. And you know, climate change is real, and the consequences could be very serious for us. But I also think there's another lesson from Chuck's story, which is that Chuck didn't get better on his own. He had help from his friend Richard. He also had a lot of help from his physical therapists and other people on his medical team who helped him get better. So climate change is not a challenge that I can solve by myself. No one of you can solve it by yourselves either. It's a community challenge, and it's something that we need to work together to address. So with that, I think we can just move into the Q&A.
Thanks, Sarah. That was great and inspiring, actually. I mean, it's great to have the scary story with some stories of resilience and response. And so, okay, all right. Okay, thanks. So I want to start. I have 3 questions, and then I know you all have a lot of questions probably, so I don't want to dominate, but I did want to make sure that we got a couple of things covered that might not be on the front of everybody's mind. The first question I want to draw attention to the fact that you're a journalist. And I think that's so important, and I think we are all very aware of some challenges that we're having with journalism in the world. And so you and I talked about this. So Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, his prize-winning work was about famine. And what he wrote about famine was that famine wasn't a failure of food. It wasn't because of food shortage. It was because of a political failure. And so his work really drew out the connection between thriving food opportunities and thriving democracies. And an important part of a thriving democracy is a free press that's working well and doing its job well. So the reason that I'm raising that is when you're doing the work of telling the big stories and the little stories about climate change, which is an important part of the free press. You're letting us know. And so, and that's part of a functioning, a healthy democracy. I want to ask you a little bit more about that, about the role of news in alerting us to challenges of climate change. And I have a couple of things in mind. One is, one of the things, just to draw on Sen again, because I just think I love him, and I think this is really important to think about how these things work, what the mechanisms are. So what the news media, what newspapers do, what radio does for people is it lets a government know where people are suffering. So it's kind of that early, news media can be that early warning system of, hey, there's some shortages here, or there's some drought here, or there's some pests here. So it lets you know where assistance is needed. And on the other side, it lets citizens know what the government is doing. So it's this two-way form of information. So what are you seeing as the role of journalism in that sense of kind of getting the stories to the people who need to know? So like letting health workers know there's an outbreak of West Nile. How's that information flow working? What can we be doing about that? What do you think we should be doing? And what's the role of citizen scientists and citizen journalists maybe in all of that process?
Sure, that's a great question. So I guess one way of answering that is just kind of recognize that it's really unfortunate that we have actually 2 crises, well, lots of crises, but at least 2 crises that I pay attention a lot to in my life. And one is the climate problem, of course, and then the other is the collapse of a lot of the traditional forms of journalism. And environmental journalism, my field, has been really hard hit by that. There have been thousands of journalists who have lost their jobs in the past 20 years, and environmental and science journalists are often the first to get cut. So at this moment where I think lots and lots of people deserve to know what's happening with the climate, there are fewer paid professionals around to actually do that work. And fundamentally, I think my philosophy in journalism is that it's our job to let people know in the information so that you can make good decisions in your lives and in your communities. So what happens when that function of democracy starts to go away? Well, some not so good things. Like there was a study, I think it was in Michigan, that found that when a community's paper went away, the officials in that town became more corrupt. The government really does respond to people watching them and monitoring them to make sure they're doing the right thing. That being said, there are some really cool projects and a lot of creative things that are happening right now to kind of try to step into that void, because a lot of people recognize that that's a problem. So one of the coolest projects, I think, that is relevant to our discussion tonight is a project called Icy Change. Does anybody use Icy Change here? Great, I can tell you about it. So Icy Change it's kind of Well, first of all, it's an app that you can download on your phone, and you can become a citizen scientist tonight. It's free. And what people who use the app can do is kind of monitor weather and climate conditions in their neighborhood and just report sightings. So like, let's say you have a bush of lilacs out in your yard, and you know, because you've lived here for 20 years, that that bush always blooms on a certain date in April. But then this year, it bloomed 2 weeks early. You can take a picture of that and say, and just report, like, this happened, and it's weird, isn't it? Or if there's a part of your neighborhood that starts to flood more often because we're getting more extreme rainfall, you can report that through this app. And what's happening to all this data that's being collected all across the country is that NASA scientists are monitoring it. They're using it to kind of ground truth what they're seeing in their satellite data, because the satellites can't see into your yard and see that your lilac bush is blooming early. At least I hope they can. But the NASA scientists find this really valuable to get that kind of report. And the other thing that's happening is that journalists are looking at this data, and the Icy Change is a partner of my organization, Yale Climate Connections, and we look at the trends that we see in citizen reports, and we write stories about, okay, so a bunch of people are reporting that their spring has been very strange this year. It's been warm and cold and warm and cold. What is going on with that? And we talk to scientists and figure that out and write stories about that. So I think that's a really cool and inspiring project. That's citizen science, citizen scientists working with rocket scientists, working with journalists to do a lot of stuff like that. And they've also done a cool project in New Orleans where they're getting people to report flooding and actually really diving into how New Orleans is being affected by extreme precipitation and sea level rise.
Thanks. That was a wonder. Who knew that all of that was going to be wrapped up in one app? That was great. Okay, so next question is about the food situation and the rising seas and things like that. When I hear you talk about that, I think we are going to have to change our diets, and we might have to move. You know, these are two things. There are some fundamental challenges that humans are going to face, probably. And I don't know how long we have, and some people are going to have to move sooner than others, maybe, or they're going to have to change their habitats in other ways. So my question to you is, what did you see, what have you seen in your reporting about how people are preparing for that? Either preparing to change our diets and either changing their habitats to keep them habitable, or preparing to just go up and in.
So your question really makes me think about one particular researcher who's at the University of Georgia. He's studying basically the question of where will people move when sea levels rise. And that's really fascinating research. So what he suggests is, it's actually quite logical. He says people move short distances when they can. They move to where their friends and family are, and they move where they have job opportunities. And so he's been able to model where people are going to move in the future. I think his work is based around the year 2100. And so what he's found is basically things like people in Miami might move to Orlando. People on the Texas Gulf Coast, like people in Austin, should expect a population boom there from people coming in. And so he didn't, his work doesn't speak specifically to North Carolina, but I think it makes sense to think about, okay, if you're living in Wilmington and you decide, okay, it's time to go, what's a short distance? Where might you find job opportunities? Where might you have friends and family? Here. No.
There's no opportunity here, unfortunately.
Yeah, or also to places like Charlotte. So I think we often conceptualize sea level rise as a problem for the coast. It's over there. But in fact, I think it would be quite useful for us here in the Triangle to think about, we might have a lot more people who want to come here. And of course, they are going to want jobs, they're going to want some infrastructure, more schools, they're going to want to drink water like all of us. And so we got to think about what kind of resources will they need. And I guess in summary, it's not just a problem for them, it's an everybody problem.
We're building the apartment buildings for them already.
That's true. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so my last question is short. What can people in Durham be doing to prepare?
I have a lot to say about what Durham can do to prepare, of course. But I'm actually curious if there are already ideas bubbling in the audience. What do you all think Durham should do to prepare?
More indoor greenhouses.
More indoor greenhouses. How come?
Well, there's new methods for growing vertically with like 1/3 less water. It's in Scandinavia and Asia already. And we're doing outdoor as a farm. We have seeds gardening. But I think indoor would be better at this point.
Can everybody hear her? Okay. Okay, so she's just talking about the advantages of indoor greenhouses that are happening in other places in the world where they use a lot less resources and you can grow your food in a smaller footprint of a space. So I think that I've heard about that too. It's a pretty good opportunity for us to grow food in a more controlled way, and that could have a lot of advantages, as I was talking about, with all the challenges farmers are going to have in the future. Other ideas?
Pressure our lawmakers or elect the correct ones.
Pressure the right lawmakers, our lawmakers, and elect the right ones. Yes, that's what she said. And I do think it's important to vote in every election.
And especially somebody that believes this is happening.
So she said somebody who believes that this is happening.
This is all fake news, though.
Right, it absolutely is fake news. I've made everything up for the past 10 years.
Reduce our consumption of energy.
So Claude's saying reduce our consumption of energy. That's another approach for sure. And I guess we hear a lot about that kind of thing when it comes to climate change. You know, reduce your energy consumption, get a better car that's more fuel efficient. You can think about reducing your meat consumption. Those are kind of the big ticket things that you can do on a personal level to make a difference. Those are the most effective kinds of things. Again, that's getting a more efficient car and reducing your meat consumption. But with all my heart, I would encourage you to think about doing those things, but not by yourself. This is a community problem. We do have to work together to solve it. And so there are a lot of other ways that we can work together in addition to doing these personal steps to address the problem. More ideas?
If you're familiar with the organization NC Warren, they have a plan. It's called Clean Path 2025, and it's a direction to shift electrical use, to reduce and transform electrical use to solar primarily, with a reduction or transferring to alternative energies or renewable resources, like 2/3 by 2025 and like 100% by 2030. And it's a specific for different cities. It's really for North Carolina, but there's different plans for different cities.
Thank you. Did everybody hear that? No? Okay. Do we have another microphone? Yeah, all right. So other ideas from the audience.
Yes, I heard recently about the cities that are becoming sustainable. They generate electricity, somewhat along the lines of what that gentleman just spoke about. But this is a city initiative where, I think somewhere in Texas, a small town in the middle of oil country, you know, they developed solar, I think mostly solar alternative energy, and the city took over or provided electrical to its citizens using completely sustainable energy. I think that'd be a wonderful initiative for Durham to undertake. I don't have any idea about the feasibility of it or what's required, but I think that'd be a wonderful activity for Durham to undertake.
Thank you. So yeah, there's basically two big categories of things that we can attack. One is the transportation system. So a lot of our carbon dioxide emissions come from our cars and trucks. And then the other big category of things is our electricity. So we're burning coal to make power to make our lights run. And so there are a lot of different groups and a lot of different initiatives that kind of go after those two categories of things. So, you know, there are people who talk about concepts like smart growth and building more public transportation and making it easier for people to use things like buses and light rail. That's part of the reason why they're advocating for those kinds of things. And then there's also, like this gentleman was saying, there are initiatives in a lot of places to use more solar energy instead of that coal or natural gas, because that also reduces the carbon footprint. And those kinds of things are definitely accessible to something like the Durham City Council. Those are things that they have the power to work on if they want. And then, go ahead.
Well, I think there are two broad issues that I don't do that. I'm going to take them out.
We need it for the
I'm surprised that people can't hear me, but I'll sing a few songs and then we'll go forward. I think that the two broad issues are consumption and the creation of energy in the most efficient and clean way. And population control, frankly, is one way to impact consumption. I'm not suggesting that something like that be mandated, but many nations in the world don't have a birth rate now that is replacement volume. The world is of finite size, and we cannot continue to basically outstrip the resources based upon population growth. So that's one thing, I think. And then the other is the Paris Climate Accord. We need to participate in that. However that has to come about, we need to do that. And we need to be conscious of the leadership role, frankly, I think that we've abdicated in the world to set the right standard, and we're not. So I'll leave that one to you.
Thanks. Yeah, in terms of population control, it's obviously extremely controversial. And I think one way of thinking about it is that if you empower girls and women around the world, they're going to make their own choices about how many children to have. And I think that's a really important thing. However, we in the United States are the biggest offender of, in terms of our historical carbon dioxide emissions. And so that's also really important for us to think about too. And because we have been the biggest offenders, it also means we have a lot of agency and we can do a lot about it here at home. Let's see. So one other thing I wanted to mention was that this sounds really silly and sort of old-fashioned environmentalism, but planting trees is one way that could be really important for Durham to adapt. Trees are kind of amazing in that they suck in carbon dioxide, and they also can cool our city by a lot. A single tree can significantly reduce the heat in the surrounding area. And they also reduce ozone pollution, so that pollution that I was talking about. So a single tree can do a lot of problem solving for us. And there are a number of organizations in Durham that are working on this and also working to kind of rectify historical inequalities in where trees are planted across the city. So I just wanted to mention that I know that Keep Durham Beautiful is one of the organizations that's working on this. And I think it can be something really important for Durham to think about in the future. So maybe we should just go to audience questions.
You talk about the failing breadbasket and the compounding of multiple breadbaskets failing at the same time. I'm curious about what transpired in the 30s with the Great Dust Bowl in the United States, and whether or not what we're experiencing now is comparable to that period of time, is better or worse. how it compares. Do you know?
Yeah, unfortunately, that question's above my pay grade. I don't know that much about the 30s. Does anybody here know much about that period? Yeah, sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
Question?
One thing I've read is that the climate change now is kind of in the books, and you were right. You, based on your experience, in other words, it's going to happen. It's going something we're going to have to all experience in places like Bangladesh, and Pacific Islands may be, no longer inhabitable in Bangladesh, which has a huge population in low areas. Is that based on your experience? Do you believe that as well?
So the half-life of carbon dioxide is 200 years, which means that 200 years from now, half of the carbon dioxide that we emit today will still be in the air. That's kind of one of the key problems with this issue, that we have put so much up in the air already that some changes are inevitable. It is going to get warmer, almost certainly. We are going to have some changes. We will have some sea level rise. In fact, that's already started to happen, as I was saying. However, that doesn't mean we are doomed or that we should give up, because a lot of people are working on solutions, and there's still time to avert the worst consequences. I'm sorry, I can't give you a more cheerful answer than that. Do you have more?
Yeah, so I actually have a comment that I think I want to emphasize even more strongly how important it is, the type of solution that you're emphasizing, this kind of community-based focus, because every person has a choice. I mean, when you were talking about people moving here from Wilmington, I was thinking, well, we could build a wall, and that sounds silly, right? But these are going to be some of the, not necessarily, well, okay, right? It sounds silly, but these will be some choices that will be presented to some communities about how you respond, and also each individual. And I'm going to use an anecdote. Another program that I work with, we were talking about nuclear war. And cheerful topics is what we specialize in. And so we, and one of the power plant gallery re-showed The Day After, which I don't know whether any of you remember that movie from the 80s. Yeah. And I watched it, don't ever watch that movie on the big screen. And I don't know whether you remember how it ends, but this man who has spent he's got a bunker. He has really kept his family safe through all of this. He's kind of preserved them. And then he gets to his house at the end after a big community meeting. I'm probably getting the sequence out, whatever. But some people have camped out in his yard, and he wants them to go away. This is my land. This is my property. Get out of here. And they shoot him, and it was a spoiler alert if you don't remember. But I was really struck, and I think about that when you think about the story, because I think a lot of people will kind of have that instinct to retrench and say, I'm going to protect my family. Like you said, some of us are affluent enough that we can imagine we can survive this. How can we hoard more resources for ourselves? And make sure that our people are okay. And what you're saying is take a different approach. Think about this as how you can make your world broader instead of smaller in response to this. And I really do think it's easy for us to think, well, of course that's the way people are going to respond. But there are going to be a lot of pressures to respond otherwise. And we're probably seeing it in other ways right now, with the pressures about the types of housing that's being built. Are we thinking long-term enough, about who we're protecting, who we're planning to protect, who we're planning to support, who's going to need safe housing and clean air and access to clean water as we're developing our communities? And it seems like what you're telling us is we probably need to be taking even more of a bird's eye view of what our community looks like, and also a much longer term view in what a sustainable community looks like. So that's just a very long comment, but I want to say how much I appreciate what you've said.
Thank you. I guess I can follow up with a comment too, which is, I think what you're saying speaks to the importance of a really well-functioning democracy. if you'll forgive me, I'm going to talk about the Little Ice Age for a second. So the Little Ice Age was a period of time from the 1300s to about the 1850, where the northern hemisphere cooled down a little bit, actually less than the amount we're expected to warm by, but there was some cooling, and it caused a lot of the similar kinds of issues. Farmers were having trouble with their crops, there were harvest failures, and there were lots of health problems. And there has been some research on that found that some countries during that time period did a lot better than others in terms of conflict. That the governments that did a better job of taking care of their citizens, they ended up having less conflict, less war, less rebellion. And so I think that fundamentally the climate change issue is also a function of democracy. And if you are working right now to strengthen our democracy, you are working on the climate issue. So if you're thinking about, well, how do I improve conditions for hungry people in Durham? How do I get my elected officials to be more responsive to me? That's part of taking care of each other as a community.
Well, it's probably a daft question, but when you talk about what mosquitoes in the West Nile, I mean, how many a percentage of mosquitoes are dangerous as opposed to the ones that keep landing on us? I'm just curious about how much we should be careful about mosquitoes.
So I don't know what percentage of them are infected. No, it's totally fine. And I think it also varies a lot from year to year. Because one thing that I spoke with Dr. Robert Haley, the epidemiologist, about was, I asked him, okay, so we had this horrible epidemic in 2012, and it's only gotten warmer since then. Why hasn't there been another one? And what he told me was, well, first of all, they don't really know. It's complicated. But one of the potential explanations is that a lot of, first of all, I should say that West Nile virus also circulates in birds. So he thinks that a lot of the birds who were around in 2012 actually either died from the disease or became immune from it. And so as our birds population cycles into a new generation of birds that aren't immune, we could have another epidemic that bounces back. But it's a very complicated part of our ecosystem that spills over and infects us. And so it's really hard to say with a lot of certainty how many mosquitoes are out there right now that are sick. Dr. Haley has actually invented a new test, though, or a new metric for studying mosquitoes, where he and his colleagues have figured out in Dallas if there's a certain number of infected mosquitoes that are caught in mosquito traps in a certain time of period of the year, that means there could be an epidemic in a few weeks. So they have now this early warning system based on the mosquitoes that they're trapping specifically around the city. And that's something that could be adapted elsewhere too.
I wondered if you talked about planting trees. They're great carbon sinks, I think is the right term. Are there, either of you know about scientific efforts to create man-made carbon sinks that might actually work and be useful?
Yeah, so that's the holy grail, right? That would solve this problem if we could just suck the carbon dioxide out of the air. And in fact, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is actually kind of counting on us inventing that kind of technology in the future. Yeah, so there are a lot of challenges with that. But basically, if we could create a lot of artificial trees around the world, then we could start to solve the problem even more than our trees are already doing for us. So there's some small scale tests of technologies that are actually running now that are sucking carbon dioxide out on a small scale. There's also been talk about basically capturing carbon dioxide and injecting it into old wells. But that has not been well studied, and there are a lot of challenges associated with it. Like you can imagine, if something goes wrong with that well and boom, we get a bunch of carbon dioxide into the air. That wouldn't be good. So it is something that people are hoping for, and it doesn't exist right now on any kind of large scale.
This is more a comment than a question. You talk about developing a community and the importance in bringing in trees or keeping trees that prevent worse disaster because it does absorb the carbon dioxide. My comment would be, as you're developing your community, quit clear cutting all the lots to put more buildings on. You know, keep some of those trees to enhance not only the look of your community as you're developing it as we continue to grow here, but also how many places can you drive by in Durham and the surrounding area and see just totally clear-cut places where there's going to be no trees whatsoever to do that function.
And that's certainly something you can talk to your elected officials about.
Oh, yeah.
Sounds like you already are. Is there another question over here?
And forgive me if this isn't really in your area, but I was kind of wondering how much power we have or our elected officials have to do anything about that. We have so much development here that's just kind of already happening, and there's so much money behind it. I mean, millions upon millions of dollars. I grew up in Wilmington, actually, and I know my sister's house survived Hazel, and a lot of the damage there was they clear-cut everything at the beach, and then a hurricane came through and just washed everything away. It's kind of now we're starting to know the value of trees, and I'm surprised that they haven't quit doing all this clear-cutting. It's ridiculous because there's so many problems. But I guess I just wanted to know, as far as policy, what is the best way to try to change policy? How do you even get, who has the power to do that?
Ed, do you have an answer on that? Come on up.
Thank you. It's a good segue. I wanted to mention a policy organization called Citizens Climate Lobby that is working from the ground up to recruit congressmen from both sides of the aisle in pairs. They started with Carlos Curbelo from Miami, a Republican, added a Democrat to match, and now I think there are probably about 35 or close to 40 pairs of representatives who are now in this climate lobby in Congress. And we can become members of the citizensclimatelobby.org and help to move that along. I think it's the most effective organization for policy. Now, what Citizens Climate Lobby is promoting is something called the carbon fee and dividend. You've heard of carbon tax, which is to put a price on the fossil fuels that is proportional to the damage that they're likely to cause. With that tax, then, to do something to offset other taxes, or in the case of the carbon fee and dividend, to give that back to the stakeholders who paid the taxes in the first place. And this is an approach that is working in British Columbia. For example, carbon tax that was passed there in 2008 and has been very successful in reducing the amount of carbon emissions in that province.
Thank you. It's Citizens Climate Lobby.
Citizens Climate Lobby.
Yeah, so my partner Max is actually here tonight. He is the chair of the Durham chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. And so he can sign you up. I, as a journalist, I can't really endorse any particular organization, but he's here tonight. So I think the larger point that Ed raises is a really important one, that if we were to have some kind of policy, like society-wide solution, like a carbon tax, like a cap and trade system, that would mean that we would have to worry less about getting individual volunteers like, okay, I will turn my lights out, I will drive less. It would start to shift everyone into reducing their carbon dioxide. It would mean we were working together to do less of what we shouldn't be doing and more of what we do want to be doing. And in fact, that's something that could happen. Those kinds of solutions can happen on the state level too. Virginia is just about to potentially start a cap and trade system there, which would also start to reduce the state's carbon dioxide emissions. And the northeastern states also have a cap and trade system. More questions? Is that it? Well, thank you so much for listening to me and coming out tonight.
So I want to say thanks to Sara.
I do have one comment.
Okay, can I finish just one thing first, and then because before I forget, for those of you who are interested in these issues, which I assume you weren't made to come here, so this is why you're here. On Tuesday at the Forum for Scholars and Publics at Duke, which is in the middle of West Campus, but not that hard to find. Some of you have actually been there before, I think. We're having a conversation about women, social enterprise, and sustainability with Neha Misra from Solar Sister, which is an organization that works in Uganda, Tanzania, and Nigeria with women selling solar lanterns to other women to deal with energy poverty issues that then has a downstream effect in those communities. Kelly Owensby, who some of you may know, who started Transplanting Traditions Community Farm outside Chapel Hill, which works with Burmese refugee farmers who work on this farm to build sustainable community in lots of different ways. And Skylar DeBray, who is a Duke senior, a graduating student who's been studying sustainable tea farming in Kenya. And so this is going to be a conversation to continue this discussion. It's going to take it a little bit more global. Our events are free, open to the public, and come with lunch. So it's at noon, noon to 1:15. You can find information on our website. There's also a flyer out there. dukefsp.org is our website. Sorry to hijack this, but I did want to make sure that you know about this, because this is an opportunity to keep talking and keep coming up with solutions as a community. So I have one more question.
Okay. No, I just had one comment and one question to you. When I look around the room, I see the average age is on the other side of the curve. And we all are, very well read and intelligent, read all the books, know what's going on. So we're just reaffirming what we probably already know here. What are you doing to teach our children about this now so they change their lifestyles or force their parents or older people to change what's going on in the world?
That's a really great question, a really interesting question. So one thing that I'm doing, and I hope that you all will participate in this, is I have a network of radio stations across the country, close to 400 now, where we're putting out 90 seconds about climate change every weekday. It's called Climate Connections. You can subscribe to the podcast as well. And one of the advantages, I think, of this program, one reason I really love it, is that it's going out to people who are just driving in their cars or happen to be listening to the radio. They're not going online and searching for climate change on Google. They just are, it's more of a push medium that goes out to them even if they're not expecting it. So that's one of the main things that I'm doing. And I guess I would turn the question then back to you all. What are you teaching your kids?
Our kids are teaching us.
Yeah, that's great. But the other thing is, I think a lot of young people feel like they don't have a lot of political power. But our elected leaders, you know how to talk to them. They listen to you. And you can teach your kids, too, how to talk to our leaders. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.